And Jack is going to speak first today, so let us know when we're back on. Okay, good.
Let's start with just some metta phrases. May you be safe. May you be protected. May you be well. May you be happy. May you hold your life with kindness and compassion. How does it feel just to hear them and to pay attention? I want to talk about something difficult that we're all in the throes of, which is the violence in the culture and the shootings that have happened. I'm not quite sure, even in myself, what's the best way to hold this all. It's hard to sleep sometimes. It's quite disturbing. And so these are things that have been soothing or helpful to me, and I'll be interested to hear what's actually helpful to you. And I don't see it as just a personal problem that we have to manage the emotions and the fears and the images, but that we have to be able to manage them in such a way that we can also respond to them wisely. Our dear friend Sharon Salzberg, colleague for many, many years, just led a retreat that ended a couple of days ago in our center in Massachusetts. She's become a really key teacher for the survivors of the Parkland, Florida shooting. So a number of those people came, but then with them, folks from Las Vegas and from other places where there'd been violence, gun violence of that kind. And it was people who'd lost children, she said, and parents who'd lost children, people who'd been shot themselves. She said, looking around, teachers who'd, protected children that were being shot at. It was a room full of people that had suffered in this way. And the teachings that she offered were first ways to de-escalate the trauma and the terror and the fear in their own hearts, and then to look to what were their values in spite of what has happened. And in a certain way, I think that we all have to find our way to do that. Now, in the traditional Buddhist teachings, if you read the words in the Dhammapada, which is kind of the most beloved verses, it says, all tremble at violence, life is dear to all. Putting oneself in the place of others, one should not kill, nor cause others to kill. And then another verse goes on, better than 1,000 hollow words is one word that brings peace. As we've heard a lot of hollow words, but what are the words and the actions that bring peace? Overcome anger with compassion, and then the most famous verse, hatred never ceases by hatred, but by love alone is healed. This is the ancient and eternal law. And it's possible, in these times to get inured to the violence or to become numb or turn away. The Buddha in his life, and looking back historically, spent some time trying to stop different wars that were happening around him and would sit, in the middle of opposing armies. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it didn't work. So if the Buddha couldn't do it, but nevertheless, what do we do? How do we respond? Part of what's true is that there's in our brain, in our neurological makeup as mammals, in this human incarnation, we have a primitive part of our brain that can get triggered into fight, flight, or freeze. And that primitive part of the brain, which is really searching for threat all the time, can get easily activated. And the work of politicians, according to some analysis, is basically to frighten the populace. And that's not a new thing. That's been going on for, thousands of years. So that I'll save you, I'll protect you, and to kind of activate that primitive part of the brain. And it's not all, what's the right word? That primitive part of the brain, it's not all unpleasant for people. There's a book that my friend James Hillman, a famous Jungian analyst and writer, researched and wrote, called the terrible love of war, and the excitement and the love of violence that also can be activated. So we have to get real about this in some way. And then, what are the teachings in response to this? Here's one of the kind of famous texts, which speaks to the fact that the primitive brain, the fight, flight, or freeze, the terrible love of war, the excitement, isn't who we really are. It's a dimension of us, but who we are and what our brain is capable of and what our heart is capable of is much more than that. Others will be cruel, we shall not be cruel, thus we will incline the mind. Others will be greedy, we will not be greedy. We will be generous, thus we will incline the mind. Others will speak maliciously. We will speak that which is true and useful, thus we will incline the mind. Others will be envious. We will not be envious, thus we will incline the mind. Others will be arrogant. We will act with humility, thus we will incline the mind. Others will be harsh without compassion. We shall establish compassion, thus we will incline the mind. And what you hear in it is instructions. Basically, these things are going to happen. They've happened before in different eras. There's always been cruelty and violence. And that's not necessarily what we have to live and enact, where we have to live, that we have all of these other capacities. Now, what's really also important is that we help one another in this. That when we understand this, we also become the carriers of a different possibility for those around us. And the story that I've told many times, because it so kind of informed my life, is of the dear friend and colleague and teacher Mahagosananda, who was the Gandhi of Cambodia, nominated many times for the Nobel Peace Prize. And when we worked together, we lived together in forest monasteries in Thailand during the Cambodian genocide. And so he was out of the country when all 19 members of his family were killed and his temple was burned and the villages around were destroyed. And so when he could, he went to the refugee camps of people pouring out of Cambodia to escape the violence, and got permission to build a little Buddhist temple in the middle of some of these camps, which had hundreds of thousands of refugees in them. And there was a warning from the Khmer Rouge underground that if anyone went to the teachings at these little temples, when they got back to Cambodia, they would be shot. So it was unclear if anyone would come, but when the temple in one of these first temple, when these camps was opened, we went through the camp ringing a gong, inviting people to come. And people poured into the central square, tens of thousands. And then he sat there, this monk in the orange robe, and you could look out and see the faces of the level of trauma that people had experienced. Almost everyone had lost family members, and it was that kind of shock in the faces of almost everyone. And I thought, what can he say to these people? And he put his hands together and he began to chant chants that they hadn't heard in some years because they were forbidden. That verse from the Dhammapada that goes, hatred never ceases by hatred, but by love alone is healed. First chanting it in Sanskrit or Pali, then chanting it in Khmer or Cambodian. And he just chanted it over and over and over until 25,000 people were chanting it with him. And you could see them weeping as they chanted. And then I realized he was speaking a truth that was even bigger than the sufferings that they carried. That no matter what the suffering is, this is still the eternal law. That hatred never ends by hatred. So these are the instructions, if you will, that have been passed down over thousands of years and generations to us of what's possible for us as human beings to stop the war in ourselves and with one another. And Ghosananda, he went to the U.S. Congress. He was at the UN for a time. He was part of the worldwide campaign to ban landmines. But when he got to the Congress, he said, what we need to do is start with banning landmines in the heart. And until we do that, we won't succeed in banning the outer landmines. So we listen to this and go, how do we hold this? How do we step back and see clearly, quiet the mind, tend the heart, see that this is dukkha. That's the first noble truth of the Buddha, that the world has suffering. Anybody not notice that? Raise your hand. You know. But it's not the end of the story. It's the first noble truth. Then there's a path to the ending of suffering. But it takes a willingness to grieve and to weep and to have courage and to not avert our gaze. But as Trudy was instructing in the meditation, to take our seat in the midst of it all with an open heart, with a loving awareness. And what I've seen is that there are people all over the world in all kinds of situations, many, many more than those causing violence, acting to prevent violence and to cause goodwill. Many, many more, but those don't make the news because the news likes to show the things that sell newspapers or sell, you on the website or keep you busy and so forth. One of the organizations that I've supported for a long time in all kinds of different ways is the Nonviolent Peaceforce. I'll put a flyer out about it out there at the end. Nonviolent Peaceforce is a vision and an organization that is one alternative to war and violence. And what they've done over many years now is train nonviolent facilitators, peacemakers, and sent them into and worked in Syria, in South Sudan, in Sri Lanka, in the wars in Guatemala, in the South Caucasus. They also sent a group up to Standing Rock, and they've trained some thousands of people, including 5,000 unaccompanied peacemakers whose only job is to protect children. And by having people from outside come and make a conversation about peace and support the locals and then train those who are local in how to do this, they've started to turn certain circumstances around. And I saw it when I was in Palestine and Israel and met with the bereaved mothers or the former combatants for peace, doing my own peace work there. I realized these are people who've seen violence, and it gives them a kind of moral authority to stand up and say something different. So there's Nayadeep, who's called the ambassador of peace, in her wheelchair in South Sudan. Part of her family was killed, her husband, some of her children, and she travels around in her wheelchair, going from one side to the other, talking about what people need in order to feel safe, and has been really successful in doing so, or Maria Ida Gidguent, who's part of the Catholic peacemaking community, and maybe connected with the Nonviolent Peaceforce in the south of the Philippines, who's gone unarmed into the most violent places and learned to sit down with the people who are creating violence and try to listen and find out what it is that they're afraid of and what they need. I also think of this conversation with Cristina Figuera that I had last year when we were doing a big event at Spirit Rock on climate change. Cristina Figuera is a diplomat originally from Costa Rica who became the main UN ambassador, if you will. I think it's the wrong term. Appointee in charge of global climate accords. So she helped with the Rio Climate Accord, and then she was the person in charge of trying to bring a climate accord in Paris for the Paris Agreement. And she was really overwhelmed by it because there was so much conflict, and she wondered how could she get 170 nations to sign on. And then she got engaged in meditation and Buddhist practice. Someone said, "You're so overwhelmed and despairing, you need to do some of this inner work yourself to learn how to tend your own heart." She went and practiced with Thich Nhat Hanh in France for a time. And then she said when she went back to Paris, she could see with new eyes that the whole paradigm there was about those who are the perpetrators and those who are the victims. And she turned the paradigm, she changed it and made it about family. She says, Mother Teresa said, the trouble with you is you draw your family circle too small. And she changed the whole language of the Paris Peace Accord from those who are the perpetrators and those who are the victims, which wouldn't get anybody anywhere, into our human family, and was able to get people to sign on. As human beings in these times, what's called upon is for us to clarify what are our values, no matter what happens, to find our ways to hold the suffering with compassion, our own and that around us, and then to act and to plant seeds in our conversations with others, you know, in our schools, in our communities, in our body politic, but from a different place. And what the Nonviolent Peaceforce has found, quoting them, there is evidence that when women are involved in a peace process, it is 35 times more likely to succeed over the decade than if it's only men. How's that?
Are we surprised?
And I think of the mothers of the plaza, you know, who stood up against the Argentine dictatorship and would, you know, they weren't allowed to demonstrate, so they would come and walk. Every week on a Thursday afternoon, they would come out in spite of threats, and some of them were killed. They would wear their scarves and they would come out and they would do it. And the great Argentine poet Cortázar wrote at some point when that was happening, the mothers are out, the military have already lost. So there's something also that's necessary about meeting the violence in a very different way, and maybe the wisdom of the feminine and the wisdom of women is part of what's absolutely necessary. I mean, I'd like to see 100,000 or a million mothers hold hands around Congress and say we're not going to go anywhere until whatever it is that's needed happens. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, a single garment of destiny. A story to read you, because you can't tell what your actions will do. That's not given to you. But what's given to you is to stand up for what matters, to speak what's true, to listen from the heart on all sides so people feel like they're understood, even those, not only those who are afraid, they're all afraid, but those who are violent, let me understand what's going on. You know, to be that place of peace in that way, and then to plant your seeds. And as Thoreau says, I have great faith in a seed. If there's no seed, nothing will happen. But convince me you planted a seed, and I'm prepared to expect miracles. So here's the story. Tell me the weight of a snowflake, a harvest mouse asked a wild peace dove. Nothing more than nothing, the dove answered. In that case, I must tell you a marvelous story, the harvest mouse said. I sat on a branch of a fir tree close to its trunk when it began to snow. Not heavily, not in a giant blizzard, no, just like in a dream, without any violence. Since I didn't have anything better to do, I counted the snowflakes settling on the twigs and needles of my branch. Their number was exactly 3,741,952. When the next snowflake dropped onto the branch, nothing more than nothing, as you say, the branch broke off. Having said that, the harvest mouse then went away, and the dove, since Noah's time an authority on peace, thought about the story for a while and finally said to herself, perhaps there's only one person's voice lacking for peace to come about in this world.
Thank you, Jack.
Over to you, Miss
Thank
Trudy.
you, Jack. And I want to thank, really everybody who comes to hear teachings and all of the volunteers, Jasmine and Edward and Marilyn and Juan and who else is here that I might, Amy and Angela and who else? Penny. Thank you. Anyway, I just want to thank all of you and also to let you know we do always need more volunteers, and that the volunteers, you don't have to come every Sunday. It's not like you have to give up every Sunday morning, but because there's a team, and that's why we need more volunteers, so we can have a team and people that all share the responsibilities. So anyway, I want to thank you for that. And last Sunday when Jack and I were teaching, we knew about the massacre in El Paso, but I guess Jack did, but I didn't know about Dayton, that we had had 2 back-to-back shootings. And, there's been so much of this, and what I wrote about in our newsletter is just really hoping that we don't get numb and inured to all of this violence, because it's happening more and more. I found a poem. I'm just going to share part of it with you. And it says, it's called How to Talk About Guns in America. Don't. That's the first line. Don't. Talk instead about the sickness, about the incredible pain a person must be in to commit such violence. It goes on in rather graphic terms that I am actually not going to share, but I will say this. I'm just going to quote some pieces of it. That first part, don't. And then speak in academic terms. Say words like misogyny and terrorism and media. And then you will sound far away and meaningless, and people won't have to listen or access their own pain. Definitely pray, because if it's the only time you talk to God is when there's bodies on the floor of the supermarket or festival or office building or movie theater or nightclub or school or other people's church, then you must be talking to God every day. You must be thinking about becoming a preacher. So I'm going to read that one more time because I really liked that part. I'm not sure if it was so clear. She's saying, definitely pray, Because if the only time you pray is when there's bodies on the floor of the supermarket or festival or office building or movie theater or nightclub or school or other people's church, then you must be praying every day. You must be talking to God every day. You must be thinking about becoming a preacher. So, the fact that this is happening more and more, I hope we will not become numb, because then we've really lost part of our humanity, as well as witnessing the loss of other people's loved ones and lives. And I read somewhere too that the shooters are often especially targeting women, and that made me incredibly sad as well. And we practice meditation, and we practice really little by little polishing, uncovering this multifaceted jewel that is our own consciousness, our own possibility for awakening and manifesting the qualities that you've all seen begin to come forth in your practice, or you wouldn't be here. Or you've seen others who've been manifesting these qualities and are saying, come on, come try this out. Or you're saying that to yourself. And you've all seen these qualities of maybe a little less judgment, or a little more compassion or caring for others, or a little more joy in your life, and more energy or more clarity. These are the things that we notice as we continue to meditate, right? You've all seen this, if only a little bit. And through mindfulness and cultivating and inclining our heart, our mind, just as Jack was saying, towards awareness and the compassion that brings wisdom along with it, we're practicing tools to free our own hearts. But what's happening in the world is very heavy. It's heavy for our hearts, and I think the freedom to experience our own direct experience of what's going on, and not try to numb it or make it go away, it's important right now. I wanted to also share with you, the poet said, I think one of the things I'm most interested in poetry is the opportunity to connect things that don't appear to be connected, to bring my own disparate parts together. Okay, so excuse me, this isn't... the opportunity to build that infrastructure internally, that infrastructure of connection, and then be able to apply that to my relationships with other people. The more connections I can find between disconnected things, the better my connections are with others. And I feel like this could be talking about meditation. This is what we do in our practice. We sit with ourselves and we begin to see the connection between the many beings who inhabit our own hearts, the ones who are merciful and kind, and the ones who want revenge and hold grudges, and the ones who, love babies, and the ones who recoil from, sick people, or, we get to see the many, many beings in our own hearts, and how they connect. And sometimes they only connect through our just willingness to sit and notice and recognize who and what they are. One of the poets that Jack and I get, sometimes people ask, well, where do you get these poems? There's a poetry journal called Rattle, and they send out poems every day. If you have questions about where to find poems, you can ask Angela, who is our resident poet here at InsightLA. Angela is taking care of the live stream. And I read the poems, but I also like to read what the poets write about the poems and their being a poet and why they write poetry. I think it interests me just like I'm interested. I wish we had time when we go around. Why do you meditate? I'd love to know. Like, what does it mean to you? Why do you meditate? Um, Here's one who, Elizabeth Wolf, she says, I write because telling stories is how we make sense of our world, how we connect with our world, how we heal, how we celebrate. I love this part. She said, I write to find the sliver of truth in all the information, mining my monkey mind for a trace of grace. And I feel like that too when I meditate. There's a way I'm mining my monkey heart for a trace of grace. I've been reading a book by Bishop Desmond Tutu these days because it's been good for me to read. It's a book about forgiveness that he wrote a long time ago, right after, I think it was in the late 90s that he wrote it, after the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. And the book is hard to read because in it there are a lot of the stories of the victims of violence and the perpetrators of that violence. And the point of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was for people to tell their stories and bear witness to each other's suffering. It was not about dispensing justice, or it was really about averting the kind of civil war that would have killed so many people in South Africa when Nelson Mandela was elected. So the stories are gruesome and difficult to read, but then you also read the response of the people who are sharing these stories. They're saying, I'm sorry. In some cases, they're asking for forgiveness. The people who lost loved ones in gruesome ways are saying things like, we actually would like to forgive and free our hearts, but until people come forward, we don't know who to forgive. And people came forward. And it required that everybody let go. The people who had been hurt had to let go of wanting vengeance, and the people who had just done horrible things to other people had to let go of the fragmentation and separation between their public and personal persona, because all of the people who do horrible things, most of them still have a family that they go home to and children that they play with, and times when they are not torturing people but are actually being nice and enjoying life. But to admit publicly to what you've done that has been secret and hidden means exposing yourself to having to be a whole person, to having to acknowledge all of who you are. And one of the things that, South Africa, of course, has had its problems. It didn't solve everything, but really great things have also happened in the last 25 years since apartheid stopped. People have, in the townships, most have at least running water, piped water, and electricity. I mean, there have been changes. They've spent I think 1/4 of a huge amount of their national budget on education. And so good things have happened in spite of course, ongoing struggles. But I wanted to read you something from Bishop Tutu. He said, he was talking about what happened. And he said, I always used to say to whites, I'm as committed to white liberation as I am to black liberation. I said whites won't be free until we are free, black people. And they thought I was spewing irresponsible slogans. We're just being nice to you, join the winning side, we won a victory. And then he says, but this was really a victory for everyone, black and white. He said, now we've all been liberated. Come share in the process of healing. So he's inviting people into the process of reconciliation. And he says, if this commission fails, you might not be around to describe it. Reconciliation is a national project. We should all be involved. And then he goes on to say, we are going to succeed. Why? And he's a Christian, so he speaks in terms of God. He said, because God wants us to succeed for the sake of God's world. We will succeed despite ourselves because we're such an unlikely bunch. Who could have thought that we, meaning we in South Africa, that we could ever be an example to the world except of awfulness? Who could have ever thought that we would be held up as a model to the rest of the world? God wants to say to the world, to Bosnia, to Northern Ireland, those were the struggles of that time, look at them. Look at them. They had a nightmare. This makes me cry. They had a nightmare called apartheid. It has ended. Your nightmare too will end. They had what was called an intractable problem. They are solving it. No one anywhere can any longer say their problem is intractable. We are a beacon of hope for God's world, and we will succeed. But I loved this part. Your nightmare too will end. And nobody can say that our problems are intractable. This is a huge message of hope for us in our current situation. And I don't, feeling whatever despair or other feelings that you may have about it. And this is, I think, to be honest about what's been happening. I know for some people you come here to meditate, to calm down, to feel better, to work with your own healing. And so you might feel, wait a minute, I didn't come here to hear about this stuff. I didn't come here to be activated and hear about traumatic things in the world. But I think we just have to be honest about what's happening in our world and how significant it is and how damaging it is, not just to the people who are actually in El Paso or Dayton or wherever, but to us as well, because we would all be better off in our lives without massacres and mass shootings going on. And so our practice, the practice of mindfulness, the whole thrust of Buddhist philosophy and psychology, is intended to help us begin to disidentify solely with a sense of a separate self. I, me, here, mine. Everything's mine. Jack is mine. He shouldn't go away. He shouldn't leave Sunday. He's mine. Right? We're working to drop away some of those distinctions that we cling to so much between ourselves and others. I'm here, safe, me, you're there. Well, good luck. We relax into meditation to begin to sense intuitively that we're not a separate self. And we need to feel safe to be able to do that. As long as people don't feel safe, we can't we can't relax. And when we can't relax, we can't learn how not to tolerate the abuses that are happening in our world and to stand up like some of this group that Jack was just telling about. And when we tolerate abuses, of course, we're undermining the wisdom and compassion in the world, not just in our own hearts, because we are the world. We really are. So we're sharing and speaking in this way also to underline the connection between the practices that we do here and what's happening in our world, and to use what's happening in our world and our reactions to it, the heartbreak, the indignation, whatever we may be feeling, wherever we locate ourselves on political spectrums, but to really be able to understand how this relates to being a separate self or feeling connected or disconnected. And the more connected we feel, the stronger our intention can be to alleviate some of the suffering in ourselves and in our world. So that is why we've chosen to speak this way today and how it links to our practice. And now I want to just mention before we open up for conversation that our ability to come together the way that we are this morning, the way that we do morning after morning on Sundays, it really is supported by your dana. That is a Sanskrit and Pali word that means gift or giving or generosity. And I mention that now because you may find that coming here and practicing together is uplifting in some way, that it's valuable in your life. You wouldn't come. It's a beautiful beach day, right? Um, and the question is then, how uplifting is it, and what can it? How might you express your appreciation? For the live stream people, I always remind you to press the donate button. For the people who are here, there is an alms bowl. I think there are even two of them in case you miss one that are out in the hallway there. So I just want to encourage you and also to remind you, because I've forgotten to speak about it for weeks now, and Abigail kindly reminded me, that you can match the dana on any given Sunday. And you don't have to match all of it. You can say, I'd like to match half of it. But that's another way, very glorious way actually, because we'll even say your name and glorify you if you'd like that. But it's a wonderful way also to just do something festive and make an offering that, you wouldn't do every week, but it's wonderful. Well, you can, but it's wonderful to do from time to time. So I'd like to open up for some sharing. Yeah, Jordan. Wait for the mic so that the live stream folks can hear you. And live stream people, if you have questions or comments, just type them in and Angela will read them to us.
I had to make some notes because this is might be a little challenging. So, in the people may be like, oh, I wish we could move on from the shootings and not talk about something else. But I do think it's really great that you guys spent time talking about this. I think it's on everyone's hearts, and I think there is something we can do individually. And I want to say something about that. It's maybe a little counterintuitive, what I'm going to suggest, because I think everyone's gravitating toward political action around our, weapons and things like this, which is obviously important too. But that's polarizing. The thing I want to suggest is that, so I'm a writer, and I've been I've been actually communicating with someone recently since these shootings who was a formative piece of the forums that these people have communicated on, the radicalized shooters. And I won't go into details about this person's story because we're live streaming and I don't want to talk about it, but I will say that people are being radicalized in our country, and they see themselves fighting for ideologies. And those ideologies, to me, from a Buddhist standpoint, I think are just kind of madness. They're just kind of these thought structures that bear little resemblance to reality. They've gone off on these tangents, right? But they've convinced themselves, they've been radicalized that these tangents are truth in some way. And I think that's because these people are suffering in some way, right? So I try to look at a compassionate approach to this and say, well, to be radicalized, one has to be alone, one has to be vulnerable, one has to be potentially craving, and I think the craving that these people feel causes suffering, and the craving that they're feeling be related to delusions of grandeur about what their life might be, or the intimacy that they lack, and craving for a kind of intimacy. And then they find internet pockets in which other people confirm these deeper, darker feelings they have, these cravings and these feelings of aloneness, and that they're unreachable. And a lot of them are sort of internet addicted, and then within this pool, they double their suffering. They focus on their suffering, and they become angry. So
what's your suggestion?
So my suggestion, I just want to paint a picture. My suggestion, I'm sorry to go on and on, but my suggestion is look for these people in your life. That's my suggestion.
Thank you. Yeah.
Look for these people in your life because they're out there, and I think that because they're running and they're hiding and they're putting out anger, they don't want to be found. And so look for people in your life that are suffering, and try to, who fit the descriptions of these shooters, and try to reach them and
Thank
show them
you.
compassion. Sorry, I want
No,
to.
that's good. Thank you. Thank you, because it is different from what people are saying, for sure, Jordan. Okay. Clark? I don't know who's.
Least it's on at least. Okay. Before I pass the mic, I just wanted to say something today. Um, and thank you so much for this community, for our group. Coming here every week is family for me and amazing. And to share feelings and thoughts with you all up there is always wonderful. Letting go and dropping away. Letting go of these things, dropping away, is so much where I'm in a little moment of drama with my family personally, and then look at the broad picture. So we come here, we've talked about Trump and this kind of thing before. We're talking about massacres in our cities now. I've said before, when we talk about Trump and where we are, he's a symptom. This goes back to Ronald Reagan and the violence of supply side, which was a way to attack poor people and disenfranchise them and give money to the rich. So there's all of this that's going on that we see month after month, day after day, and we're thinking about how do we live with this. And I'm reminded of two things. So one, I want to ask, this is leading to a question about equanimity, which we've spoken about here before. And Jack had mentioned 4 parts of equanimity a couple months back. I think the third part was about broadening scope as a kind of feature of equanimity, or how to find equanimity. And I've used that a lot in my life since then, but I'm needing it right now. And I wondered about the other 3, was my question, the other 3 parts of equanimity. But so in my life now, Robert and my son, had a drug overdose on Thursday morning and was in the hospital, and we might have lost him. But luckily we did the right things, and he's still with us, and he's still here. And so now we have this very personal drama, while we have slaughters in El Paso, while we have Trump in America. And this whole question of, like, how do we live through this? How do we make sense of this? And so equanimity certainly pops up as, like, keeping some frame of reference so that we don't get flooded and overwhelmed by stuff is obviously so important. I think with my son, the thing that I'm realizing personally is we go through these drama in our lives. We have a car accident, we have something like this. And I'm realizing that making it through is the first big step. My son is still alive. But the scary part for me is not really that, he almost died at 4 a.m. on Thursday. It's that I'm not out of this story yet. He could die next week. And I keep thinking, well, I lived it through. We're through the worst part. And then I keep experiencing, that's what you said last month, when he tried crystal for the first time and heard things and saw things and he swore, I'd never do that again. That scared the hell out of me. And then he did it again. And it's like our lives were confronted with this stuff of slaughters that occur in El Paso. There's going to be more slaughters before the end of this year. And so that's what I suppose gets me to equanimity. That's what gets me to, it's jumped out at me 2 or 3 times, the Baba Ram Dass quote, that, what we're doing when we live our lives is we're holding the suchness of life in the big picture while we're also holding our social security number, like, exactly at the same time. and I'm dealing with what programs are going to keep my son alive next week, while I'm also thinking about, like, why is Trump here? Why do we have so much hatred? And that's the nature of what we live through, is we just have these, and so I think I'm just walking through it. There's a trust and a belief that I think I'm a good human being. I think my son's a good human being. I think Robert, my partner, is a good human being. And for some reason, I just believe it should work out if we're good human beings. And we don't know that. So back to equanimity, it's that one thing that helps me is to keep opening up the picture here and saying, like, rather than get consumed by my son and what will save him, it's trying to open it up and say, there's thousands of kids at risk. This month there were thousands of kids that nearly killed themselves, and some did. And it's just what we live through as human beings right now. And there's slaughters in El Paso, and there's going to be slaughters coming up. There will be. And it's living through it in a way with some compassion and love. And that's why this community is so much, is to be able to come in here on Sunday and feel like I'm not alone and feel like we have family. And I think as human beings, we're pack animals. So my question is, what were the other 3 equanimity features so I can get some help here?
All right, Clark. First of all, big group hug, because that's terrifying. Terrifying. I'm so sorry that happened, and I'm so grateful he's alive. I'm really, really sorry that you've gone through this. And in a way, you just gave a talk. I mean, I don't mean, I'm not trying to shame anybody, including you, Jordan. I mean, you had a lot to say. And I mean that you were giving a talk on equanimity. That's what I meant. You're asking the question, but you're also answering the question with your talk. That we go through things. I remember once being so upset and quite self-righteous about things my husband had done. And I was in a long meditation retreat and talking to Joseph Goldstein and just like sharing, let's say. And he listened very calmly, quietly, kindly. And then he just looked at me and said, "People do things." I thought, that's it? And so do we. Well, I didn't like that part so much. But yeah, people do things. It's really hard. I don't have in my head the other 3 aspects of equanimity, although I certainly have taught them. I cannot retrieve them right in this moment, but I promise I will bring them back to you. Next week, I think Eileen Ibarra and Mike Zeitel, 2 new teachers who sort of migrated to InsightLA from Against the Stream, will be teaching, because I'll be up at Spirit Rock. But I will promise to bring them in a couple weeks, or post them or something. And Jack, you may want to say something.
Yeah, I'm also, as a parent and a human being, I'm also really moved by what you say. All the emotions, fear and love and grief and all of those things. And one of the elements of equanimity that you described that is part of those principles is common humanity. And you said it in that way that it's not just you, but that there are 100,000 parents in the country right now who are worried for the safety of their children's lives, of safety of drug overdose and so forth. And it's not just you. And I remember sitting with Zen Master Thich Nhat Hanh years ago in a small group, and somebody was asking him about karma and said, why did it what was the karma of the Vietnamese people that so many millions of tons of bombs should have been dropped on their country and so many people killed? Why did that happen to the Vietnamese? And he got very quiet. And then he looked up and he said, it didn't happen to the Vietnamese. It happened to all of us. And there was a kind of truth and grief in what he said, but also something really important, because he was saying, we're in this one together, and it's not somebody else's karma. So your expression of common humanity lets us keep our hearts open and not be individually taking it as it's ours personally, but it's ours because this is our family, and what can we do? And there's something about that that's empowering.
And that's what Bishop Tutu was saying when he was talking about whites being liberated as well. You know, exactly that. So, yeah, thank you. Do we have any live stream?
Someone named Carl wanted to add that he heard Jack's talk with Sam Harris and thought.
Mike, here's the mic.
How do I forget this? Well, am I good?
Still low.
Mike?
Hello? Hello? Mine's on.
Thanks, Kenny. Sorry, guys. I work here. I should remember the rules about how. Okay, so did it go away?
You're remembering the rules, but is the mic on?
Yeah. It was working a sec. Okay,
Yeah,
there we
okay.
go. So Carl wanted to just add that he had heard Jack's talk with Sam Harris and that it was fabulous, and he wanted to say thank you to both of you for the information that you're sharing, that he was in awe of just the conversation today and really appreciated the dialogue. And there was sort of a more general kind of reiteration of the question about how can we have equanimity through all of this. Liz Weiner wanted to know.
Well, thank you, Carl, for your appreciation. And I think we've been, as we talked to Clark, talking about Liz's question. Debbie, go ahead.
No, I was just going to ask, it may be similar to this in the sense that...
Hold it
how do you-
closer.
Your mouth.
Hello? It may be similar to this, what he's asking, but how do you hold the suffering without letting it crush you? And at the same time, on the opposite side, how do you protect well, it's the same thing. How do you protect yourself? But how do you hold it without...
How do you hold it without it crushing you?
Yeah,
I'm asking you. How do you do it?
I meditate. But
You meditate.
well, but
Thank you.
it does crush me. It crushes me, and then there are times where I avoid it. A lot of times where I avoid it. Not avoid it totally. I mean, I watch the news. I don't watch the first 10 minutes with a certain person on it. But, I watch the news, and then it crushes me. It crushes me. And I go on. But if I let it all in, if I really, truly let it all in, I'm not sure I would be here.
I think that's really where we have to have the open-heartedness and the connection and the lack of separation of loving kindness, for example, and the boundaries that the equanimity helps us put in place. And it's a compassion practice too, self-compassion, of just understanding when it's too much and when it's time to do something different. Like Jack and I saw a very beautiful movie. I'm not just going to talk about meditation. We saw a very beautiful movie called Maiden about the women who were the first to sail around the world. It was just very uplifting. It's just good to have some balance of reminders of the goodness of each other and of the world. And also, I liked what you said about, yes, I get crushed. And that getting crushed, if we didn't, there would be something wrong. But we can survive being crushed because of this is where impermanence is good news. In one moment we're crushed, but in the next moment something else happens. Like yesterday, I won't say it was Jack, but I found 2 pieces of chocolate on the floor. I was so excited. was like, I don't even have to go to the cupboard, open the package. You know, this is out of my hands. There it is. It's right, offering itself to me on the floor. So I think having some balance is
Chocolate is the answer.
well, actually, no, just noticing the fun things that do happen was more what I was pointing to. And yeah, you could say meditation and chocolate. Thank you. Alana.
Good morning. Thank you so much for your talk. It's really nice to be here and hear you guys.
Nice to see you back.
Thank you. So something that I've been trying to do, because I'm feeling a sense of apathy or disconnection to what's going on as well, and not sure how to digest it. I don't have a television, and I stopped listening to NPR because I just feel like it's filling my head with negative things, and I don't find it to be useful. But what I do is I go to the children's hospital and donate platelets every 2 weeks. Because I'm reminded, my mother always told me, like, it starts with your community. Like, if I can, because I don't know what to do. You know, like, I don't know where to go. I don't know how to help. Do I send food? Do I
That's
send money?
That's a significant thing. It takes hours to give platelets.
Yeah, but what I do is I listen to you guys when I'm doing platelets. Like, I listen to Dharma Seed. It's amazing.
Why
lay
didn't
there.
I think of that?
But it's awesome. Like, I feel like the good vibes of, you know, Dharma Seed are going through me, and I'm like laying there and I get fed snacks. It's like I'm on an airplane. It's amazing. And it's the only time I sit down. But I find that if I can do something for people around me, something for my community, if my neighbor needs food, if my friend needs food, that I'm food, so anything that, has to do with giving back to the people around me, like Jordan was saying, if you see somebody suffering, like, participate, don't shy away from their pain, like lean into it. And it also is a reminder, like every time I go to the children's hospital, the parking lot is full. So there's a hospital full of children that are sick and suffering. And maybe I can't help the children at the border at this present moment. However, if I can have an affect on somebody that, they're never going to know it's me. They're never going to know that whatever is coming out of me is going into them. But
you know.
But well, and like, it's like something.
Yeah. And I think that's the key. Something, that we do something. And what you've described is a beautiful example of finding something that you can do, number one, and that's meaningful. It's meaningful for you, and it's meaningful for every child who needs platelets. So thank you for that. And I know that there were other hands up, and I just want to say we're come to the end of our time. So please chime in next time we're together, and come next week, and I will see you in 2 weeks. But let's just sit for a moment. So as a way of expressing our gratitude and appreciation for having the time, the luxury, the privilege of getting to be together in this way, we offer whatever we've learned, whatever has been beneficial. We offer the goodness of our practice to all beings everywhere, without exception. May we and all beings grow in our capacity to open our hearts and to do something to help ourselves and each other when it all feels like too much. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, live stream friends. I want to remind you about the donate button, the Donna bowls out in the lobby, but also just to say hi to somebody before you leave. Maybe somebody you haven't said hi to before. Just introduce yourself, say hello, and I'll see you in 2 weeks.